two very rapid runs through the history of the attempts to create a national health program in the United States from when they began at the turn of the 20th century, and then we'll stop this phase of our discussion with the passage of Medicare and Medicaid in 1965. And we'll try to cover as much territory as we can in the next 2 days, so I'm going to proceed at a very rapid rate, and I'm going to tell you what materials I'll be weaving together, be going back and forth between various kinds of things. If you don't have with you, it will be useful to have with you the two of the handouts that I gave last time, and one was this one, which had the cover of the book that Sue Ladwig and I and a couple other people co-authored. You have that. You should have that nearby if you don't have it. There are extra copies here. Anyone need a copy? Okay. Could you start passing these around and raise your hand until you get a copy? And then the handout that actually was distributed before that was this one with Rubinow on the front. How many need this handout? It's a 9-sider. All right, again. Okay, so my strategy is to cover this very rich and very important and interesting material as quickly as I can without hopefully missing anything important. And I'm going to do it by weaving together 3 basic sets of sources. The textbook does attempt to go over this territory, and I'll point out to some specific pages where it does this. I think the textbook provides a good foundation, but needs to be supplemented. There are a number of readings that have been put on Blackboard, which also add depth and nuance to the discussion, and I'll be referring to those. There are primary sources, particularly by Rubinow and by Winslow, that are very important to look at. There is the article by Byrne, Brown, et al., as I pointed out, cited by the Obama administration and Supreme Court brief, that the actual article is on Blackboard, and it's a good overview, at least the Obama administration thought so. The editors of the American Journal of Public Health thought so. So that's worth looking at. And there are handouts. I will be weaving these 3 things together. So let's start by looking at the attempts to get a national health program from more or less the turn of the 20th century until those efforts really exploded and then petered out in the period immediately after the U.S. entry into World War I. That's covered by Shi and Singh on pages 99 to 101. And if you have with you, but make a note, to turn to pages 99 to 101, starting with the right-hand column on page 99, and going essentially to the top of the right-hand column on page 101. Here are some of the highlights that Shi and Singh bring to our attention. One of the first points they make is that efforts to create a national health program really began in Europe, specifically in Germany, and the first real efforts were those done by Chancellor Bismarck in Germany in the 1880s. So you can probably date the first real national efforts to 1883, when Bismarck pushed pretty hard to create a sickness insurance program in Germany. That example was picked up, modified, replicated in various ways in Europe, and by the early 20th century had jumped the pond. There was an organization in America, the American Association for Labor Legislation, which tried to promote various kinds of safety net measures for workers in the United States, because the people who were connected with that association and drew widely from various sectors of society, academics, public health, social scientists, etc., leaders of philanthropy, were worried that there was enough disquiet and enough real problems with the way workers were treated, the way workers were injured, the way workers were made sick by the conditions of employment, that those fits of disquiet might lead to some real political agitation. As it turns out, that fear wasn't as well founded in the United States as it was in Europe. One of Bismarck's major motivations was to try to stop the growth of a very strong Marxist-oriented, labor-based social democratic party in Germany, and his measures were deliberately aimed, he was very explicit about this, he is quoted as saying this, to try to take the wind out of the sails of the growing left so that he would get on with whatever his priorities were for Germany, its industrialization and militarization, etc., without having labor slow that down because of its objections to the way they were being exploited. So these social safety net measures were in Bismarck's mind, and in the minds of many Europeans who copied him, very much political strategies that were meant as ways of co-opting reform, of using reform in a co-optive way to take the energy of what would be a working class movement and to move it away from radical leadership to more moderate political objectives, because workers were now given something by the state for which they were grateful and without which they may not have survived. That's the motive that really went through Bismarck. This can be explored at greater length in other places. In my spring course, Health, Medicine, and Social Reform, for example, we'll talk more about that in more detail. But here it's sufficient to note that was the original motivation. It was understood in Europe, and it was understood by the leadership of the AALL. So that's how the campaign began in the United States. That reform effort in the United States, led by the AALL, fit perfectly with the general reform agenda of the progressive period, which you can date from about 1900 to about 1918, when it begins to peter out. And in that progressive period, there are all kinds of reforms: child labor laws, tenement house conditions, all sorts of other things, women's rights, political rights for cities, and the like. Part and parcel of that progressive movement was an attempt to create a base of social legislation, a safety net. And it was taken up by the Progressive Party, which became the principal political instrument of advancing that agenda, which in 1912 ran Teddy Roosevelt, who had already been president of the United States, so he had very high prestige and recognition, obviously, as a Republican. He broke with the Republican Party and felt that the Progressive Party, with its reform agenda, better represented what he wanted to achieve. Isaac Max Rubinow, who was an immigrant to the United States from Europe, where he saw directly and understood these social safety net measures, was invited by the team that created the platform of the Progressive Party in 1912 to write the plank in the platform supporting sickness insurance. And Roosevelt endorsed it and proudly ran on that platform with that plank in it. So here is one of the ways in which it comes together. The AAL, as she and St. tell us now on top of page 100, continued those efforts in the early 19-teens despite Roosevelt's defeat. Essentially split the field so Wilson, the Democrat, could win. Whom he might not have done so if the Republicans essentially hadn't been split because of the appeal of Roosevelt on a different party. And there were efforts to create various measures. Some succeeded and some didn't. Workmen's compensation was promoted and succeeded. So by 1914, the AALL said the next major frontier in social legislation is going to be to achieve sickness insurance on the same basic principle, following the same model as workmen's compensation. There's a general bill that's drafted. It is deliberately to be modified by each state to fit particular state's needs and priorities. At that point, the constitutional understanding of the United States is not that there is some major federal authority, which only really emerged during the New Deal under Franklin Roosevelt. At this time, the United States was still at that point in its constitutional evolution to believe that social welfare measures, as these were the primary concern of the states. And that's where the authority lay. That's where the responsibility remained. So The national organization pushing for this created one model piece of legislation and then tried to recruit leaders in each of the states who wanted to promote that agenda to find the right language to modify it to suit that state's circumstances. What Shi and Singh also point out is that in that period, the American Medical Association, which had began essentially as a self-defensive trade association of the regular physicians fighting off the homeopaths and other competitors in the middle of the 19th century, founded in 1847, by this time, by about 1900, 1910, the AMA was presenting itself as a reform-minded organization. It supported food and drug legislation, it supported medical educational reform, and it supported this piece of social legislation. It recruited national leadership, major figures in medical education, the dean of the Hopkins Medical School, for example, who were universally admired and trusted to be presidents of the AMA, to lead the organization into this new social reform future. But as Shi and Singh point out, this is the middle of the left column on page 100, support for the AMA's social change proved only superficial. The rank and file of the organization was essentially making this temporary alliance with national liberal leaders in medicine in order to make the American Medical Association look like a reform-minded organization rather than an organization that was concerned primarily with narrow professional self-interest. But as the authors suggest, that emerged, and eventually the rank and file of the AMA rose in rebellion and threw out its liberal academic leadership and resorted to form. And as it resorted to form and it's concerned primarily with its own financial self-interest, abandoned state by state by state the campaign for national health insurance, and the American Medical Association, by the period right after World War I, was no longer an ally. Some other things that emerge from these few pages in Shi and Singh. One of the major political dynamics that was set in motion by the U.S. entry into World War I was the attempt by the Wilson administration to drum up American enthusiasm for participation in the war. The war had begun in 1914. It was raging in Europe for many years, killed thousands and thousands of young men on all sides, and the United States stayed in isolation. The United States at that point had a very isolationist attitude towards foreign policy. Wilson knew that he needed the United States to get involved. He knew that he needed to bring new focus to American efforts and attention, created something called the Creel Committee, led by a guy called Creel, to create, deliberately, propaganda, it was so called, to convince Americans that they needed to be involved in the war. They should not remain in their isolationist position. And the way he did that, or the way the commission did that, was to enlist the budding Hollywood film industry and the budding public relations industry, which were emerging at this time in the 19-teens and the early 20s. It's when the real flourishing of those enterprises began. To use their talents and their skills and their manipulative methods to convince Americans that the Germans were horrific enemies, they were barbarians, they skewered babies on their bayonets, etc., and to condemn everything German. Previously, Germany was considered by many American academics especially as the great models, the leaders. Every leader of American academic medicine of the late 19th and early 20th century had spent some time training in Germany because that's where the action was. That's where the best work was being done. William Henry Welch, the founding dean of the Hopkins Medical School, was found by a recruiter, in effect, in a German laboratory and convinced to come to the new enterprise, Johns Hopkins Medical School, with the promise that you will be given the same kind of equipment and support that you're getting in Germany so that you can conduct your research in the United States. And that's what brought Welch back to the United States. Germany was the great haven of medical science and general sort of social legislative enlightenment. Creel Committee tried to turn that all around. Everything German was awful, evil, barbarian. And that meant that if Germany, under Bismarck, had created sickness insurance, national health insurance, then it too was evil. And that attitude became very important in the subsequent battles over national health insurance. It was now perceived as an evil concocted in Germany, created by the same chancellor who would lead his troops to skewer babies on bayonets. Yes?
Sorry, who brought Welsh?
Right?
Who brought Welsh to Johns Hopkins?
Well, there were many people who wanted Welsh to come to Johns Hopkins. There was a group of philanthropists who were building the Johns Hopkins University and then the medical school somewhat later. So the very people who supported that university, Johns Hopkins himself was a philanthropist. Johns Hopkins had built his money on railroads. Most of the major American philanthropists, this is a side note, built their money in the new emerging technology, and so admired technology and science, and Germany seemed to be the center of that. Rockefeller built his fortune on oil and oil refining, and Carnegie on steel and steel manufacturing, Hopkins on railway, Carnegie on railways, that sort of thing. So these were the kinds of monies that were available. Later, the Rockefeller Foundation, when it was created as a philanthropic entity, got directly involved in trying to build up still further the Johns Hopkins Medical School. The two great scientific universities on the German model that were created in the United States that became the beacons of all the rest, and so that what we think of now as a prestigious Ivy League, Harvard, Yale, and so on, had to catch up with these other institutions because they were left behind in old, gentlemanly, theologically oriented training going back to the colonial period. The two great universities with strong scientific basis and with strong Rockefeller foundations and Rockefeller support, philanthropic support, were the University of Chicago and Johns Hopkins. These were the great scientifically oriented centers. You have a question?
Yes. Was Rubinow still alive at that time? Or?
Rubinow was very much still alive. Rubinow didn't pass away until sometime in the 30s. But as I'll mention in a moment, Rubinow essentially was cast aside. So Rubinow, when the American Medical Association was at its reform height, was recruited to lead their reform efforts. Rubinow shared all these values. So Rubinow was hired and then dispatched to various states as those states were getting closer to creating a bill and trying to start pushing it through their state legislature. But when everything turned with the Creel Committee, America's entry into World War I, everything German turning negative, and then that reinforced later in 1917 by the Russian Revolution. And so now there was a double whammy that would fall upon someone like Rubinow, who was an avowed socialist. He admitted to it. He was one of the founders of the American Socialist Party, a democratic socialist, not a Bolshevik. But he was labeled with the Bolshevik label because he was, in fact, a Russian. That was his country of origin. And so Rubinow had the double whammy of promoting a German program, which was then replicated in Europe, and being associated somehow with that other evil that emerged in 1917, Bolshevism. And these two negatives were very much associated with it. Rubinow had been hired by the AMA to promote their efforts, and as the politics of 1917 played out, he was fired by the AMA because he was no longer acceptable in the United States. And in fact, Rubinow had a great deal of difficulty getting a job. He was, even though everyone regarded him as brilliant and incredibly well informed, no one would hire him. And Rubinow showed up in an interesting way. He was recruited by the Hadassah Jewish Philanthropic Organization to help organize medical aid to Jewish settlers in Palestine. And that's where he spent about 5 years before he came back to the United States. And the only major job that Rubinow got was as a leader of Jewish philanthropy in Cincinnati. That's not a bad thing. It's an important city with a large Jewish population, large German population as well, but it's a tremendous come down from where he was before. And Rubinow was never allowed, even though everyone knew that he was the best informed on social legislation, was never again allowed to participate in any major effort to push social legislation in the United States. He was excluded from the CCMC, which I'll get to in a little while, and he was ignored by the Roosevelt administration when the Roosevelt administration began its social welfare legislation with the New Deal. Although everyone knew his expertise, he was considered too dangerous to be associated because of what happened to him in 1917 and 1918. She and Singh also point out that by 1920, the turn of the AMA back to a very conservative and self-defensive position was complete. The rank and file had risen up and thrown out its academic leadership like Welch, liberal academic leadership. The mechanism of political decisions in the AMA became consolidated around the House of Delegates, which is a representative structure, representatives from each state, county medical society, and so on. That was a very, very conservative body. And in 1920, as she and Singh point out on page 100, right-hand column, the AMA's House of Delegates approved a resolution condemning compulsory health insurance and turned against any kind of state insurance. That meant, in their minds, even public health measures, more modest public health measures aimed at, let's say, maternal and child care. Anything in which the state was involved was anathema. All that the AMA would support would be privately delivered medical care in the individual doctor's office. And as she and Singh point out, the main aim of this resolution passed by the House of Delegates in 1920 was to solidify the medical profession against government interference, as they interpreted, with the practice of medicine. On page 101 in She and Singh, there's passing mention of the role of the insurance industry, and they're joining the campaign of SALT and negativity. As She and Singh point out, bottom of the left-hand column on page 101, the insurance industry feared losing its income derived from various insurance products that it sold, including products for funeral benefits and so on. And so they lined up and used various tactics, overt and covert, to try to undermine any version of public or state-supported insurance because it would be threatening to their business and to their bottom line. It also points out the pharmaceutical industry feared the government because the government could act as a monopoly buyer, or at least a buyer with a large number of clients, and would therefore have leverage, negotiating power. It's an issue that's still being fought over, and if you remember what we said about Medicare Part D, the modern version of the pharmaceutical industry, Big Pharma, was concerned about the very same thing and persuaded the Bush administration and the Republican Congress to include language in Medicare Part D that would exclude government using its group purchasing power to create discounts. That was only changed to some extent during the efforts by the Obama administration in promoting the Affordable Care Act, which includes provisions about closing the donut hole in Medicare Part D and various other measures once the Democrats had control. So that's the basic outline of what happened in the first few years, and let me just add to that a little bit more and then move on from 1920, which is we'll consider that a turning point when the AMA goes on record as militantly opposed to any form of state involvement in the provision of medical care or even of public health help to mothers and children. One of the things that you have on Blackboard is this Voices from the Past, which includes a selection of the very first paper on social insurance ever published in the United States, which is Rubinau's paper on labor insurance that was published in 1904 in the Journal of Political Economy. So you can read his language and follow his reasoning. And then following that is a brief little bio sketch about Rubinau and his career, some of the highlights of that Liz Fee and I wrote as part of this article. So that's on Blackboard, and you can go to that. You can also look at Rubinau's portrait, which was not included in the Voice from the Past article, on the first page of that handout that I gave before. And as we talked about last time, you can see some of the material that was produced by the American Association for Labor Legislation, its New York affiliate, which also was very connected with the women's political movement, women's labor political movement. And there's also evidence on the handout of some of the deliberate efforts by the insurance industry to undermine the efforts to promote a state-run program. So that the New York League for Americanism seems to be claiming that the proposals that are being advanced for the state legislature that derived ultimately from Rubino and the ALL were in fact anti-American, they're German, they're compulsory, this is not the way Americans do things, and it looks like the product of something called a patriotic organization, the New York League for Americanism. But as I pointed out quickly in passing, last time I showed you that if you look at the actual street addresses in Buffalo and Syracuse and track them down, which you can do with historical registers, you find out that at those addresses were commercial insurance companies. So this was a kind of right-wing front organization that was meant to discredit those efforts, promoted by the commercial insurance industry, which feared, as Shi and Singh point out, that it would be losing its business, or some of its business. One other thing to point out is that if you look very closely at page 3 of that same handout, this is the cartoon that emphasized the strength of the woman in the family. This was part of a very powerful women's labor movement, powerful in New York State. So it's probably unreadable because the print is so small, but I can assure you that what it says there in tiny little print is New York Women's Joint Legislative Committee, which was a very important combination of efforts to create suffrage, to get women to vote, and to use a strong base in labor. One of the strongest women's unions that had very important influence in various forms of social legislation was the ILGWU, which you may have heard, the International Lady Garment Workers Union, many of whose members were immigrants, worked in the garment workers for very poor wages, under terrible conditions. Many of them died in the famous Triangle Shirtwaist Fire, leaped to their death because the doors that would allow them to escape from the fire were locked closed to keep them contained in that work facility. This became a very, very important sort of organizing cry for that union, and they had a very important role. Now let's move on and continue our quick march, this time through even more territory and a longer period of time, from 1920 to 1965. There is an overview of this period and these events in Shi and Singh. It's a bit scattered, it's jumbled, it's chronologically confusing because Shi and Singh, between pages 96 and 105, cover things in a way that doesn't follow a simple chronological order. They jump back and forth. But let me just pick out the high points, reordered in a chronologically coherent way, in proper order, and just mention the major events, which will then become the framework for another level of more subtle analysis using handouts and material on Blackboard. So just using Shi and Singh, selected pages between 96 and 105 for the big developments between 1920 and 1965 when Medicare and Medicaid passed. They point out on page 100 that the AMA's House of Delegates, we've already talked about that, condemned compulsory health insurance. They point out on pages 97 to 98, see how disordered it is, that is 3 pages before, that in the later 1920s and in the 30s, one important development that began in the American environment is that in the absence of any efforts, any movement, any energy at that point to creating a national health program, various other things began to develop to fill the gap. The need for insurance was becoming more and more apparent to lots and lots of people, not only to social scientists and policymakers, but to individuals, to union members, to various other labor organizations. And so in the late 1920s and in the 1930s, what were called Blue Cross and Blue Shield plans began to grow as ways of getting insurance coverage for members of particular groups, teachers in Dallas, Texas, or government workers in other parts of the country. Blue Cross and Blue Shield would be, at that point as it began, a not-for-profit entity with strong social orientation to try to create group health coverage using community-rated methods even before the Depression, and then these Blue Cross Blue Shield plans grew during the Depression. That's mentioned pages 97, 98. The commercial insurance industry was not convinced until this time that it could make a big profit on health insurance. So they stuck to other kinds of insurance. Accident insurance, life insurance, funeral insurance, so on and so forth. It was Blue Cross and Blue Shield as essentially a community-oriented, not-for-profit entity and initiative that showed the way actuarially to the commercial insurance industry that significant profits could be made in health insurance, and the big insurance companies, Prudential, OMA, et cetera, began to get involved in health insurance, but only after the lead was taken and the methods were explored by the Blue Cross Blue Shield initiatives. By the late 1930s and then into the 1940s, liberal congressmen, senators, and members of the House of Representatives had begun to get back to the efforts to create legislation for national health insurance. The lead in these was Senator Robert Wagner, a liberal Democrat from New York. He was joined by a congressman, Democratic congressman from Michigan, named John Dingell. Actually, Dingell's son, and now Dingell's son's widow, have been serving in the U.S. House of Representatives, and they still represent strong support for creating national health legislation. It was the Wagner, and then Murray was another person who got involved. So these were generally called the Wagner-Murray-Dingell or the Wagner-Dingell-Murray bills, Wagner being the lead legislator. And he was also very important in other key pieces of legislation. It was Senator Wagner, who was one of the primary supporters of the Social Security Act in 1935, which was the signal legislation of the New Deal. Roosevelt didn't move in the direction of the New Deal for several years. He had to feel his way, understand the depth of the crisis the United States was going through, understand what was politically feasible. But by 1935, when he was ready with Senator Wagner, who provided a very significant co-sponsorship of initial legislation. And it was Senator Wagner who also supported a very important piece of legislation that allowed labor unions new rights and new visibility. It was the Wagner Labor Relations Act that created the National Labor Relations Board, also passed in 1935. So Wagner is a key figure in this, and he is mentioned by Shi and Singh and some of that legislation on pages 101 to 102. Another important development in this period as we sweep through it was the growth of employment-based health insurance that grew in the unusual circumstances of World War II. Political efforts were largely stalled because national attention focused on the prosecution of the war and making sure that the means and the financing were there to support the war effort. There was, of course, conscription, drafting of men into service, and all that that implied. One of the things it meant is that a very significant part of America's labor force was not available at the very time that industry needed to increase its productivity, transform itself from manufacturing cars to manufacturing jeeps and tanks, and to get them out in sufficient number, to transform General Electric from manufacturing electronic products like radios and so on, and to find ways of using its technology to support the development of radar and other important pieces of electricity-based communications, and so on. You had to take the clothing industry and produce uniforms. You had to take the food industry and produce food and meals for the huge number of people who were now in military service and conscripted into the ranks. But that meant that a very significant number of those in the labor force, able-bodied men between 20, 30, 40, in that range, would not be available to these very industries that needed to increase their productivity. It led to a couple of things. It led to women being actually allowed to and even invited into some industries which they had never been imagined to be part of. And you've all seen, I'm sure, the famous posters from this period of Rosie the Riveter. Rosie can do it. She can use those techniques and that machinery to help build boats and tanks and all the rest of it just as competently as the men who were serving overseas already in arms. It also meant that whenever there were workers of competence and skill and efficiency, whether men or women, that industries wanted to retain them. There were considerable profits to be had if they could meet their production quotas and sell high to the U.S. government, which was desperate to get all this equipment and materiel. How do you keep your workforce when there's competition to recruit it away to the West Coast and work on the shipyards in Seattle and so on? How do you keep them where they are needed in Michigan or New York or wherever the other industries are? And so industries began to explore ways of making employment in their particular industry more attractive. There were strict national limits to what could be paid in salaries. Strict national limits imposed on the financial dealings of the company, so they didn't have the same freedom of operation they might have in other than emergency wartime circumstances. The War Labor Board made lots and lots of rules about this. But one of the things that industry discovered, with the help of Blue Cross and Blue Shield being pioneers in this in the 20s and 30s, was that workers really liked health insurance benefits. And if you offered them health insurance benefits and paid for it, it could be presented as not salary. We're not trying to compete for workers by raising wages because there are national limits set on that by the War Labor Board to prevent profiteering by certain industries, scooping up labor from various parts. So you can't do that, but no one quite knew what to do with health insurance benefits. Health insurance became this magnet for attracting and keeping workers, and it became a scene of dispute between the growing power of organized labor, which was now growing rapidly after the Wagner Labor Relations Act of 1935 in the early 40s. Who was in charge of offering workers benefit packages? Was it just the employer, and the only relevant decision and consideration were the employers? Or did labor have a say in this? Were health insurance benefits something that could be negotiated over around the conference table in collective bargaining negotiations, the mechanism for which was created by the Wagner Labor Relations Act? No one quite knew. And that's what the authors point out was going on in the growth of employment-based insurance on page 99. They point out that only after a lot of struggle, especially post-World War II when the war ended, there was a lot of struggle between labor and management over who owned the rights to negotiate and set the limits for health insurance as a collective bargaining, was it a collective bargaining target? And the case actually got to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court decided that yes, manufacturers, employers could provide health insurance as a benefit beyond salary, but labor had the right to negotiate with management over the particular content of the benefit package. This was only resolved after several years of struggle by a major Supreme Court case, and then the floodgates opened. Because at this point it was now clearly legal. It was at a point of compromise between labor and management, and commercial insurance companies had learned their lessons, had learned from what Blue Cross and Blue Shield had taught them, knew from the experience during World War II that health insurance was a very attractive commodity, and could be highly profitable. So once the Supreme Court made this decision, the floodgates opened, and major industries across the country in all fields began to provide health insurance as a part of their special conditions of employment, and unions had the right to try to negotiate with management over the particular content of the benefit package. Do we want this kind of coverage? Do we want that kind of coverage? Do we want to make sure that this plan covers the workers' wives' pregnancies, etc., and those medical needs? Those became specific topics of negotiation. And that, in the period of the late 40s and 50s, is when there was the most rapid growth of commercial insurance covered health insurance benefits that spread via this mechanism, industry by industry by industry. It didn't stop Wagner, Murray, and Dingell, or now President Truman, who became president. He had been Roosevelt's vice president. Roosevelt died very early in what would have been his fourth term. Truman came in. He was a New Deal Democrat. He had earned his sort of political stripes during the New Deal, was quite progressive during the 1930s and 40s, and he was strongly convinced that there should be a national health insurance program in the United States. He strongly supported the Wagner-Murray-Dingell bills and wanted to see them made into actual legislation. So when in 1945 he became President of the United States, he became the first sitting president in the Oval Office who strongly supported national health insurance and used his position as a bully pulpit to try to promote national health insurance. Teddy Roosevelt did not succeed in becoming president with this platform. Franklin Roosevelt had resisted. He had flirted with national health insurance, but usually backed away. But it was his vice president who became president, Harry Truman, in 1945, who became the first strong proponent of national health insurance while sitting as U.S. president. And that meant that the forces of opposition were newly mobilized and fought strongly against it. So what Shi and Singh tell pages 102 and thereabouts is that the AMA, now faced with what they perceived to be a major threat, they hadn't changed their position since 1920, they were opposed adamantly to any form of government involvement, were now even more opposed and more frightened by the possibility that something might happen. They allied with conservative Republicans, like Senator Taft of Ohio, against these social insurance measures. They very quickly used the red baiting and red labeling techniques. They called these measures socialistic, socialized, Bolshevistic. It infuriated President Truman, who knew these were complete misrepresentations of what the legislation that Wagner was proposing would have meant. They were not socialism in any form, but those labels were used very effectively by the opposition. The AMA joined an alliance with the commercial insurance industry, joined an alliance with the pharmaceutical industry, joined an alliance with very conservative Republican senators like Senator Taft, who regularly condemned these measures and claimed they were Bolshevistic and so on. The AMA was also so concerned about possibly losing this political battle that it has the dubious distinction of pioneering our modern methods of lobbying by hiring a professional public relations firm, the Whitaker and Baxter firm, which generated some of the most dramatic, inaccurate, yet very effective publicity used against national health insurance and the measures that President Truman and Senators Wagner and Murray, etc., were promoting. The Whitaker and Baxter public relations efforts are mentioned by Shi and Singh on page 102. And so, national health insurance, as a program in which government was involved, was considered absolutely off the table by these political forces. And the big battle of the late 1940s and early 50s was, is there any surviving legitimacy for the program that President Truman and other political figures like Senator Wagner were promoting, or were they so tarred and tarnished by the labels of socialism and communism that their opponents were very deliberately using to discredit them? Was there any possible survival? Well, all that possibility died completely with the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, who was elected in 1952. He was a war hero. He had moderate views on most issues, but he didn't like the idea of a national health insurance program. He, in fact, called it socialized medicine, inaccurately, but he called it that, and it stuck. And so under his presidency, one of the major events took place that helped shape the U.S. health system from that point forward, is that he signed a tax measure that was created by the Congress under that, in that period, that made getting health insurance benefits through employment specially favored with the tax code. It was very advantageous to both employers and employees to get health benefits which were considered pre-income. This is pre-tax income, pre-tax benefit, and that led to very significant financial advantages for both employers providing it and employees receiving it. And that's when, in 1954, when Eisenhower signed that new tax reform measure, America really got consolidated in providing insurance through commercial mechanisms as the major form of insurance. And the selling of insurance, the marketing of insurance, grew even more rapidly. This is discussed on page 99 in Whitaker and Baxter. There's an allusion on page 103 to some really very surprising development. The spread of commercial insurance was good for employers. It was good for most employees, as long as they were actively engaged in their employment before they retired. What happened, though, when people reached the retirement age? Who would provide their health insurance as they became older, more likely infirm, more likely sick, more likely in need of hospitalization and other medical services? There was nothing for them. There was no program for the elderly. By 1935, because of Social Security, there was Social Security retirement income. But connected to it was no medical program, no way of providing for their medical benefits. And here were people who had worked faithfully in various industries, had done important work adding to America's productivity and economic boom, who were rewarded by the salaries they got and by the benefits they achieved in health insurance, who raised their families, participated in the American way of life, and so on. And then by the time they were 65, were suddenly facing very rapidly increasing medical costs because as insurance spread, as you can easily imagine. The cost of medical care rapidly inflated because it seemed so easy and unpainful as long as you had insurance to reduce the overall price. This is, of course, the general one example of moral hazard. All of that drove up prices in the medical care field. And that meant that when people most needed medical care, especially expensive medical care, in their elderly years, when they were older and more infirm generally, and had less income because they were surviving on Social Security retirement or some retirement benefit that their employer or the union helped provide, they were in a major crisis. So out of the very success of the spread of insurance through employment, through this set of events that I've just quickly summarized based on material in Shi and Singh, and that only to this point, that very success led to the next major problem. What do you do with retirees and their spouses? How can you take care of them when they most need medical care? And in the minds of some, the only possible answer was to now create a unique form of national health insurance aimed at those 65 and over. And that form of insurance, which would have been universal, in which the government would play a major role in collecting revenues and distributing them and running the system, was what was labeled Medicare. And so the deliberate strategy by some very clever and far-thinking people in the mid-50s is that if we cannot, because of the political environment and because of the spread of commercial insurance and all that we've just summarized, get a universal program across the age spectrum, those over 65 were particularly attractive, sympathetic, vulnerable, but powerful political group, and we should refocus the efforts in the United States from trying to achieve, as in Europe, insurance across the age spectrum and to create a really unusual, uniquely American universal program by focusing on those over 65. And that was the Medicare strategy. The first piece of legislation that tried to advance it was offered by a legislator named Farrand. And in 1957, there was a Farrand bill that began to work its way through Congress. When Medicare passed 8 years later, it was on the basis of the Farrand bill, what support it built in the late 50s, what increased support it built in the early 60s, especially when John Kennedy endorsed it in his campaign and supported it in his administration. And we'll have to come back to that history when we pick this story up on Wednesday.